Before we begin, forgive me for not being able to pronounce some of these names. In the year 1856, a child was born in Sakmadika, near Buhudla, in the northern Somali region, a land set between Somaliland and today's Togdheer. The Horn of Africa in that time was a world of contrasts, where the land itself commanded the rhythm of life. It was a semi-arid savanna, stretched wide with thorny acacia trees, dry grasses, and scattered wells. Rain came only in its seasons, and when the skies held back, families moved restlessly with their herds in search of survival. The heat of the sun pressed down hard on the plains, yet when night fell, the air cooled, and the stars burned across the desert sky in an endless canopy. Water and grazing land were wealth, and to be born there was to inherit both the struggle and the poetry of such a place. Before we go further into this story, let's pause for a moment. There are some words we will be using often, and I want to make sure everyone knows what they mean. This story is not only for historians or people in universities, it's for everyone. Nomads. These were people who did not stay in one place. They moved with their animals, camels, sheep, and goats, searching for water and grass. Their whole lives followed the seasons and the land. To be Somali in that time was often to be a nomad. Sayyid. In this story, we will often call Muhammad Abdullah Hassan the Sayyid. The word Sayyid is an honorific title. It can mean a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, through family line, but it is also used as a deep mark of respect. In Somali history, when people simply say the Sayyid, they are talking about him, the leader, the poet, the sheikh who would not bow to colonial power. Dervish, Darvish. Movement. The followers who gathered around him called themselves the dervishes. The word darwish in Arabic means a Sufi, someone who turns away from worldly pleasures and lives only for God. Under the Sayyid, this word became the name of a movement, an army, and a community. From 1899 to 1920, the dervish movement fought to keep Somalia free and Islam pure, becoming one of the most famous anti-colonial struggles in Africa. The people of this land were proud pastoral nomads, carrying in their souls the memory of ancestors who had guarded these plains for generations. Among them were the Dulbahante, a subclan of the great Darod family, keepers of camels and cattle, men and women whose lives moved with the herds. Children were taught early to live in rhythm with this world, herding animals under the scorching sun, reciting Quran by lantern or moonlight, and listening to poems that told of both warriors and saints. Clan honor, courage, and the verses of God were the first foundations of identity. Yet this childhood world was not closed off from the rest of history. The wider world was shifting in 1856. The Horn of Africa stood at a crossroads. Somalia itself remained fiercely independent, untouched by European control. But the coastlines were already alive with Arabian, Ottoman, and Persian merchants. Towns like Zayla, Harar, and Mogadishu were alive with the sound of children reciting Quran in the schools, the voices of teachers in the Sufi lodges, and the busy trade of merchants unloading their goods along the coast. While the inland nomads roamed the open plains, the coastal cities held the heartbeat of Islam and trade, serving as bridges between Africa and the wider Muslim world. And beyond Somalia, the winds of colonial ambition were already rising. That very year, Britain declared control over Lagos in West Africa. European explorers were charting unknown routes, missionaries were eyeing lands along the Indian Ocean, and empires were quietly measuring territories that had yet to be claimed. The Somali plains had not yet seen the full weight of empire, but the shadow was drawing closer. It was into this world, of harsh sun and cooling stars, nomadic honor and Quranic recitation, bustling ports and creeping empire, that the child, Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, opened his eyes for the first time. His earliest breaths were drawn in a land where faith, clan, and the struggle for survival were woven into one fabric. His story would grow from this soil, shaped by both the beauty of his people's traditions and the storm clouds gathering at the edges of their horizon. Like every Somali child of his time, young Mohammed's mornings began with the rhythm of Quran lessons. The sun had barely risen when the voices of children filled the air, repeating verses in unison, their small wooden boards etched with inked script. Yet even among those children, he was different. His parents knew it, his teachers saw it, and the community whispered it. He was obedient, focused, and loved, the kind of boy who carried himself with a quiet discipline that drew respect. By the age of 11, that discipline had blossomed into something extraordinary. He had memorized the entire Quran. The community looked at him with awe, for a child so young to become a hafiz was rare and precious. His soul was already overflowing with wisdom, and those around him could sense it. This was not by chance. It was by Allah's mercy, a gift that marked him early as one who was destined for something greater. Every verse he carried within him became a light, shaping his heart and sharpening his spirit. And because Allah loved the work of this boy, doors began to open. His studies did not end in the small corners of his village. Instead, his path stretched outward, leading him to travel far, to sit with scholars, and to drink from the wells of knowledge beyond his homeland. Step by step, Allah was preparing him, not only through the words he recited, but through the discipline of obedience, the endurance of travel, and the fire of faith growing within him. Though he was still young, he was already becoming known. The boy who memorized the Quran was no longer only a son of his clan. He was a son of the wider Muslim world. And in time, that memorization, that obedience, that mercy, all of it would rise within him, readying his soul for the weight it would one day carry. By the early 1890s, the doors of knowledge had carried Muhammad beyond the Horn of Africa. He set out for the Holy Lands, joining the long journey of pilgrims crossing the Red Sea toward Mecca. For a young Somali already rich with Quran and years of study, the pilgrimage was more than a ritual. It was a doorway into a larger world of faith. The streets of Mecca were alive with scholars, merchants, and seekers from every corner of the Muslim world. Here, knowledge was exchanged as easily as greetings, and a man could find his heart lifted by wisdom carried from distant lands. It was in this atmosphere that Muhammad encountered the Salihiyya Sufi order, founded by Sheikh Muhammad Salih of Sudan. The Salihiyya were reformers, men who spoke of purity in worship, strict devotion to Tawheed, and the need to revive Islam from within. Their words struck something deep within him. He had grown up disciplined, obedient, memorizing and traveling for knowledge, but now he was being given a vision that faith must not only be preserved in the heart, but defended in the world. He listened, he studied, and he absorbed their teachings. To him, the Salihiyya were not offering something new, but reminding him of what had always been true. That Islam is clarity, that Allah is one, and that Muslims must guard against any practice that leads them away from that truth. In their circles, his soul found a sharper edge. He was no longer only a seeker of knowledge, he was becoming a reformer, a man who would carry this flame back to his people. The pilgrimage completed, his prayers lifted in the sacred sanctuary, Muhammad returned to Somalia with something more than the honor of having stood at the Kaaba. He returned with a renewed vision, a calling, the Quran he had memorized as a child, the wisdom of his teachers, the discipline of his youth, and now the fire of the Salihiyah. All of it was gathering in him like storm clouds ready to break. By the end of the century, Muhammad Abdullah Hassan was no longer just a voice of reform. He was becoming a banner under which people gathered. His words had spread far beyond the study circles and prayer gatherings. In the north, in the deserts, in the coastal towns, his call echoed. Return to Allah, guard your faith, and resist the grip of outsiders. In 1899, his preaching transformed into a movement. What began as lessons and recitations grew into an organized body of followers who called themselves the dervishes. They were men of faith, warriors of spirit, and seekers of purity who pledged loyalty to him not only as a teacher, but as a leader who spoke with clarity in a time of confusion. They were drawn by his poetry, his sermons, and his vision of a Somalia united under Islam and free from colonial chains. The dervish movement was not born in peace, but in the rising storm of empire. The British had tightened their hold in the north. The French and Italians had carved pieces of the Somali coast. Ethiopia had swallowed Harar and looked further toward Somaliland. To Muhammad, this was not only a political invasion, but a spiritual corruption. He preached that accepting the treaties of foreigners was a betrayal, both to clan honor and to Allah. As his followers grew, the colonial powers began to notice. To them, Muhammad was dangerous. He was a man who could move hearts with words, who could unite clans that had long been divided, and who called foreign treaties nothing but chains of slavery. The British gave him a name meant to mock and discredit him, the Mad Mullah. But among his people he was the Sayyid, the noble leader, the sheikh who carried both Quran and sword, the man who would not bow. That year marked the true beginning of open resistance. The dervishes, guided by their Sayyid, began to arm themselves, prepare their bases, and preach not only with words, but with action. 1899 was the year the struggle changed shape. The quiet forge of his youth had ended, and the fire of his mission now burned in the open. The boy of obedience, the student of Mecca, the reformer of Salihiyah. He was now the leader of a movement that would shake empires. The dervish movement did not wait long to step into the fire. By 1900, the Sayyid and his followers were no longer just gathering in circles of prayer. They were marching as an army of faith. Their bases spread across the plains and deserts of northern Somalia, built in places where wells and terrain gave them both life and protection. The colonial powers quickly marked him as a threat. The British, the Ethiopians, and the Italians, though divided by their own rivalries, found common ground in their fear of him. To them, he was a man who disturbed the order they were trying to force upon Somalia. To his people, he was a sheikh who embodied the Quran, a leader who would not let foreign flags rule their soil. In 1900, Ethiopian forces marched with British support to try and crush the dervishes. But the Sayyid's men struck with fierce discipline. They knew the land, they carried the fire of belief, and they fought not only for themselves, but for Allah. Victories at places like Jidbali and other skirmishes proved that the dervish were not a passing rebellion. They were a force that could not be ignored. But their fight was not only on the battlefield. The Sayyid used his poetry like arrows, piercing both his enemies and his own people's hearts. In verse, he condemned those who signed treaties with foreigners as sellouts and warned of the shame that would come from betraying Islam. His poems were memorized, sung, and carried across the land, making him not just a commander of men, but a commander of souls. By 1904, the dervishes faced a massive assault. British and Ethiopian armies combined in a campaign meant to wipe them out once and for all. The battles were bloody, and many of his followers fell. Yet even in defeat, the Sayyid endured. He retreated deeper into the interior, rebuilding, regathering, refusing to surrender. The British could win a battle, but they could not kill the spirit he had awakened. After the heavy battles of the early 1900s, many thought the Sayyid would fall silent, but he was not a man who surrendered. Instead, he withdrew into the vast interior of Somalia, where the desert itself became his ally. There, among the thorny plains and wells hidden from foreign maps, he began to rebuild. What was once only a movement was now shaping itself into a dervish state. He chose Taleh as the heart of this new order. In those years, his followers constructed great fortresses, stone walls, towers, and enclosures that rose like a city in the desert. These forts were not only military strongholds, but symbols of permanence. They told both his enemies and his own people that the dervish were no longer scattered warriors. They were a nation in the making. Inside these fortresses, the Sayyid ruled as both sheikh and leader. He led prayers, issued judgments, guided disputes, and organized his men for war. His sermons and poetry continued to flow, sharpening the loyalty of his followers and condemning those who aligned themselves with the British or Italians. To the dervishes, he was more than a commander. He was the living example of endurance, a man carrying both Quran and sword. Meanwhile, the colonial powers tightened their nets. The British entrenched themselves in Somaliland's ports, the Italians expanded in the south, and the Ethiopians pressed from the highlands. But even surrounded, the Sayyid refused compromise. To him, treaties were chains, and submission was betrayal. His call was simple: Somalia must remain free, and Islam must remain pure. By 1910, the dervish movement stood bloodied but unbroken. Its forts rose defiant, its fighters roamed the plains, and its leader, the Sayyid, continued to inspire with every word he spoke. The world around him was shifting under colonial weight, but within those desert walls, another world was being built, one carved out of resistance, faith, and the dream of freedom. By 1910, the dervish were no longer just a scattered resistance. They had fortresses in the desert, a leader who spoke with fire, and a reputation that reached across the seas. But with fame came pressure. The colonial powers, British, Italians, and Ethiopians, had learned that defeating the Sayyid was not simple. Every time they thought him crushed, he would rise again, stronger than before. Yet these years were not only about battles, they were also about betrayals and shifting loyalties. Some Somali clans, tired of war or tempted by promises, aligned with the British. Others held firm with the dervishes. The Sayyid responded fiercely in his sermons and poetry, calling out those who abandoned the struggle and praising those who stood true. His words became both sword and shield, keeping the spirit of resistance alive even when weapons failed. The fortresses of Taleh became the heart of his state. Built of stone and guarded by faith, they stood as symbols of Somali defiance. Inside, life was not easy. Resources were scarce, the land unforgiving, but the dervishes endured. They prayed together, fought together, and lived with the constant knowledge that empires wanted to erase them. By the end of the decade, the British grew desperate. In 1920, they turned to a new weapon: aerial bombardment. For the first time in Somali history, planes flew over Taleh, dropping bombs onto the desert forts. The walls shook, the sand turned to smoke, and the dervishes, though brave, were forced to scatter. The Sayyid fled into the Ogaden region, carrying his spirit unbroken even as his state was shattered. Later that year, weakened by illness, he passed away. But death did not silence him. His poetry remained on the tongues of his people. His vision lived on in Somali memory. To the British, he had been the mad mullah. To his people, he was always the Sayyid, the sheikh who carried Quran and sword, who stood when others bowed, who endured until his last breath. The story of Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan is not only Somali history, it is Black history. Just like so many before and after him, his life was a testimony of resistance. When the world pressed in, when empires with far greater weapons tried to break him, he did not give up. Even when the cause looked lost, he still stood. Many leaders ask themselves in those moments, am I doing the right thing? Should I surrender? But the Sayyid did not surrender. He kept striving, carrying Quran in his heart and sword in his hand, until the last breath Allah gave him. That endurance is what makes him a part of Black excellence, the tradition of men and women who refused to bow, who left their names in history books not by chance, but because Allah wrote their struggle as a sign for the generations after them. His name remains because his fight was not his alone. It was Allah's plan to free his people from those who sought to abuse and control them. So when we tell his story, we are not only remembering one man, we are remembering a chain of resistance, a stream of excellence, a truth written in blood and faith, that no matter how heavy the chains, there are always those who will rise to break them.